Long before newspapers, television, or social media, before the idea that history could be questioned or revised, truth was something solid, heavy, and immovable. In the ancient world, truth was not debated. It was displayed. It stood tall in temples, carved into colossal walls, and reinforced by religion, ritual, and royal authority. To the people who lived beneath these monuments, what was written in stone was not opinion or interpretation. It was reality itself. And no civilization understood this power better than ancient Egypt, where stone was eternal, memory was sacred, and the pharaoh was not merely a king, but a living god whose words shaped the order of the universe. Egypt, in the 13th century BC, was an empire at its peak, rich in gold, armies, and divine confidence. Its society was built on the concept of ma'at, the cosmic balance that kept chaos at bay and guaranteed prosperity, stability, and justice. The pharaoh was the physical embodiment of this balance, chosen by the gods to maintain order through strength and victory. To admit failure was not simply political weakness, it was cosmic danger. A defeated pharaoh meant a shaken universe. And so, Egypt did not merely fight wars to conquer land, it fought them to preserve belief. Far to the north, beyond the deserts and river valleys Egypt claimed as its own sphere of influence, another power had risen quietly but relentlessly: the Hittite Empire. Unlike Egypt, the Hittites did not see their king as divine. Their strength lay not in monuments, but in strategy, diplomacy, and an advanced understanding of warfare. From their capital at Hattusa, they controlled much of Anatolia and exerted pressure deep into Syria, directly challenging Egyptian dominance over vital trade routes and vassal states. Between these two powers stood a single city that mattered more than any other: Kadesh. Kadesh was not a large city, but it was a strategic masterpiece. Positioned near the Orontes River, it controlled access between the Mediterranean coast and the interior of the Near East. Whoever held Kadesh could decide the flow of armies, goods, and influence across the region. For decades, Egypt had claimed Kadesh, lost it, reclaimed it, and lost it again. Each loss was an embarrassment, each failure a crack in the image of Egyptian supremacy. By the time Ramses II came to the throne, Kadesh had become more than a military objective. It had become a symbol of unfinished destiny. Ramses II was young, ambitious, and acutely aware that immortality in Egypt was earned, not inherited. He did not want to be remembered as a caretaker of power, but as a conqueror whose name would echo for eternity. From the very beginning of his reign, he understood that victories did not end on the battlefield. They lived on walls, in poems, and in the minds of future generations. And so, when he prepared to march north toward Kadesh, he was not only assembling an army, he was preparing a story. 4 massive divisions, named after Egypt's greatest gods, Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Set, marched beneath banners and prayers, accompanied by priests, scribes, and artists who would record what was about to happen. The assumption was absolute. Egypt would win. The gods would ensure it. And whatever unfolded on the plains near Kadesh would be remembered not as it occurred, but as it needed to be understood. What Ramses did not yet know was that the battlefield he was marching toward would produce not a clear victory, but something far more powerful and far more dangerous: the first great lie ever carved in stone. The Egyptian army did not march north in secrecy or fear, but in full confidence, stretched across the land in a long, disciplined column that reflected centuries of imperial certainty. Thousands of infantrymen advanced beneath the sun, their bronze weapons polished, their shields marked with divine symbols, while chariot units moved alongside them in carefully planned formations. This was not a desperate campaign, it was a statement. Egypt was not coming to negotiate. It was coming to reclaim what it believed was already its own. Every step toward Kadesh reinforced the idea that victory was inevitable, that resistance would collapse under the weight of Egyptian authority. Ramses II led from the front, commanding the Amun division, the most prestigious of the 4, carrying with him the full symbolic weight of Egypt's supreme god. The other divisions followed at measured distances, a formation that worked well in friendly or secure territory, but one that depended entirely on accurate intelligence. And intelligence in the ancient world was fragile. There were no maps as we understand them, no fast communication, no reliable way to verify reports beyond interrogation and trust. Information traveled slowly, and lies traveled easily. It was during this advance that Ramses received what appeared to be critical confirmation of his expectations. Two captured nomads were brought before him, men who claimed that the Hittite king Muwatalli II was far to the north, retreating in fear and unwilling to face the Egyptian army in open battle. They spoke convincingly, reinforcing everything Ramses already believed: that the enemy was disorganized, hesitant, and already beaten in spirit. What the pharaoh could not know was that these men were not accidental informants, but deliberate instruments of deception, sent by the Hittites to shape Egyptian decisions at the most dangerous possible moment. In reality, Muwatalli was not retreating, he was waiting. Hidden behind Kadesh itself, with the city masking his movements, the Hittite king had assembled a massive force drawn from across his empire and its allies. His army included thousands of chariots, heavier, more destructive, and designed for shock rather than speed. Where Egyptian chariots relied on mobility and precision, Hittite chariots were built to break formations and crush resistance. Muwatalli had chosen the terrain carefully, understanding that surprise would be more valuable than a formal confrontation. Believing the enemy to be distant, Ramses pushed forward aggressively, allowing his army to stretch dangerously thin. The Ammon division reached the area north of Kadesh first and began setting up camp, unaware that the rest of the Egyptian force was hours away. The illusion was complete. The pharaoh believed he was ahead of a fleeing enemy, when in truth he was walking directly into an ambush. The gap between belief and reality widened with every passing moment, turning confidence into vulnerability. By the time the truth began to surface, it was already too late. Egyptian scouts finally captured additional Hittite agents and extracted the real information: that the Hittite army was not distant, but dangerously close. The revelation shattered the narrative Ramses had accepted. The enemy was not afraid, the battlefield was not empty, and the battle that was about to begin would not be fought on Egyptian terms. As dust rose on the horizon and the sound of approaching chariots echoed across the plain, the grand illusion collapsed. What Ramses had mistaken for weakness was in fact preparation. What he believed was victory waiting to be claimed was a trap already sprung. And in that moment, the fate of the campaign, and the story that would later be carved into stone, was sealed not by strength, but by deception. The attack came without ceremony, without warning, and without mercy. From behind the city of Kadesh, where the terrain concealed their movements, the Hittite chariots surged forward in a thunderous wave. Thousands of wheels cut into the earth at once, raising clouds of dust so thick they swallowed the horizon. For the Egyptian camp, still in the process of being established, the assault was not a battle, it was a catastrophe unfolding in seconds. Soldiers scattered, formations collapsed, and order dissolved into instinctive survival. The Ra division, still marching toward the camp, was the first to be struck. Stretched along narrow routes and unprepared for a full-scale engagement, they were hit head-on by Hittite chariots moving at full speed. The impact was devastating. Lines shattered instantly as heavy chariots crashed into infantry ranks, trampling men and equipment alike. Panic spread faster than commands could be given. Entire units broke apart, turning retreat into rout, and in their collapse they carried fear straight toward Ramses's position. Inside the Egyptian camp, chaos replaced discipline. Tents were overturned, supply wagons smashed, and horses bolted in terror. Officers shouted orders that vanished beneath the roar of battle. The carefully planned structure of the Egyptian army, its spacing, its timing, its reliance on coordination, disintegrated under the force of surprise. For a brief but critical moment, the pharaoh himself stood dangerously exposed, surrounded by fragments of what had been an organized army only hours earlier. According to later Egyptian inscriptions, it was here that Ramesses became something more than human. The walls of temples would claim that, abandoned by his troops and betrayed by fate, the pharaoh called upon the god Amun and single-handedly charged into the enemy, striking down countless foes in divine fury. But when stripped of poetry and propaganda, the reality was far less heroic and far more fragile. Ramses did fight, but not alone, and not as an unstoppable force. He fought because there was no alternative. Survival demanded action. What likely saved the Egyptian army from total annihilation was not divine intervention, but a series of desperate human factors. Some chariot units regrouped and counterattacked, exploiting the mobility of their lighter vehicles. The terrain, clogged with bodies and wreckage, limited the effectiveness of the heavier Hittite chariots. And crucially, the Hittite forces, believing victory already secured, broke formation to loot the Egyptian camp, a fatal pause that gave Ramses precious time. As the dust began to settle, the battlefield transformed once again. What had been a crushing ambush turned into a grinding struggle for control. The arrival of elements from the Ptah division, and later the remaining Egyptian forces, stabilized the situation just enough to prevent complete collapse. The battle did not end in triumph, but in exhaustion. Neither side achieved decisive dominance. The plain near Kadesh became a graveyard of broken chariots, fallen soldiers, and shattered certainty. By nightfall, both armies pulled back, bloodied and uncertain. The Hittites had failed to destroy the Egyptian army. The Egyptians had failed to capture Kadesh. Strategically, nothing had been resolved, but narratively, everything was about to be rewritten. The battle itself had ended in stalemate, yet the story of Kadesh was only beginning. By the morning after the battle, the Egyptian army had survived, battered and bruised, but far from victorious. Chariots lay shattered. Soldiers limped across the plain, and Kadesh remained firmly under Hittite control. Strategically, the campaign had failed to deliver what had been promised, yet this failure would never appear in the temples of Egypt. Ramses II, acutely aware of the fragility of perception, understood that history was not only recorded in the results of battle, but in the way those results were presented to the world. And so, a monumental decision was made. To transform survival into triumph, defeat into glory, and ambiguity into absolute certainty, all through the unyielding permanence of stone. Reliefs and inscriptions were commissioned across Egypt, stretching from the walls of the Ramesseum to temples at Abydos and Luxor. These carvings depicted a scene far more heroic than reality. Ramses charging alone into the enemy, chariots falling before his divine might, Hittite soldiers fleeing in panic, the pharaoh himself illuminated by the favor of the gods. Every detail was calculated. The height of Ramses's figure, the size of his bow, the chaotic fall of his enemies, all designed to overwhelm the viewer, to impress not just the eyes, but the mind. The message was simple. Egypt had triumphed, and its pharaoh was invincible. This was the birth of what modern historians might call state-controlled propaganda. Unlike a written account, which could be debated, or oral stories which could be contradicted, stone was immutable. Generations would walk past these carvings and absorb a reality crafted by power rather than fact. Kadesh became less a battle and more an experience, a lesson in loyalty, divine favor, and the unassailable authority of the king. The actual events, the failures, and the near catastrophe were buried beneath artistry, symbolism, and repetition. Meanwhile, the Hittites were well aware of the truth. Their archives, preserved in clay tablets at Hattusa, recorded Kadesh as a hard-fought stalemate, a tactical engagement where neither side achieved decisive victory, but the Hittites successfully defended their territory and retained Kadesh. They made no grandiose claims of annihilating Egypt, nor did they exaggerate the pharaoh's heroics. To them, Kadesh was a successful defense, a demonstration of strategy and patience. The contrast between these two versions reveals the deep divide between military reality and perceived history. Years later, the pragmatic solution arrived in the form of diplomacy. Around 1259 BC, decades after the battle, Egypt and the Hittites signed a peace treaty, the first of its kind in recorded history. This treaty, preserved in both hieroglyphs and Akkadian cuneiform, recognized territorial boundaries, pledged mutual defense, and formalized peace between two equally matched powers. By this point, the story that had already been carved in temples could not be undone. History had already been written in stone, long before it was agreed upon in ink. Reality and narrative had diverged irreversibly. In the end, Kadesh survived less as a battle and more as a monument to human perception. The pharaoh had failed to decisively conquer, but he succeeded in shaping how the battle would be remembered for millennia. By turning a near disaster into an eternal triumph, Ramses II did not merely win a battle, he won memory itself, creating a story that would outlast facts, eyewitnesses, and even time. The first great lie carved in stone was complete, and it would echo across the centuries, reminding the world that perception, carefully curated, can be more enduring than truth. The Battle of Kadesh did not end when the armies withdrew, nor when peace was negotiated, nor even with the death of Ramesses II decades later. Its true impact unfolded quietly, across generations, not on the battlefield, but in the human mind. The story carved into the temples, reinforced by priests, scribes, and state ceremonies, created a memory that was far more powerful than the battle itself. Ordinary Egyptians, who would never see the battlefield and could not read detailed reports, came to understand Kadesh as a miracle of divine power, a testament to their pharaoh's invincibility. Stone became the medium of belief, and belief became the reality that endured long after armies faded into dust. This is the enduring genius and danger. By immortalizing a fabricated victory, he demonstrated that history could be constructed, and once solidified in stone, it was nearly impossible to contradict. No eyewitness testimony, no enemy report, no factual account could overcome the monumental authority of these carvings. The monuments themselves were not passive, they were active participants in shaping memory. Each image, each exaggerated figure of the pharaoh, each defeated Hittite soldier etched into the walls, was a deliberate exercise of power, a manipulation of perception that has echoed for over 3 millennia. Modern historians eventually began to unravel the truth. The discovery of Hittite archives, particularly clay tablets preserved at Hattusa, revealed a starkly different version of Kadesh, a carefully defended city, a skilled army, and an Egyptian assault that nearly failed. When these records are compared to Egyptian reliefs, the magnitude of Ramesses' propaganda becomes clear. Kadesh was not a triumph, it was a survival story, a stalemate, and yet it would be remembered as victory. The discrepancy between reality and memory offers a profound lesson. History is not always a record of what happened, but of what those in power decided should be remembered. The consequences of Kadesh reach beyond ancient Egypt. It provides one of the earliest examples of how perception can be weaponized, how a narrative, once fixed in place, can outlast evidence, suppress dissent, and guide belief. The pharaoh did not need to destroy his enemy, he only needed to control the story. In doing so, he influenced generations, established a precedent for rulers across the world, and left a warning for posterity. The truth may survive, but it requires effort, skepticism, and courage to uncover it. Ultimately, Kadesh is less about chariots and blood, and more about memory, authority, and narrative. It teaches that wars are not only fought with weapons, but with stories. That victory is not determined solely by strength or strategy, but by the ability to shape perception. And that even in the absence of conquest, power can be immortalized if it controls the memory of events. The first lie carved in stone did not merely alter history, it defined it. And for all who study it today, Kadesh is a haunting reminder that what we remember is not always what really happened. There is a unique silence that only monuments possess, a silence that is not emptiness, but authority. When history is carved into stone, it does not plead or suggest, it commands. The walls of temples in Egypt do not ask for belief, they demand it. Generations of Egyptians walked past these colossal reliefs of Ramesses II, absorbing every image as absolute truth. The pharaoh, a single figure of divine perfection, standing unchallenged before the enemy, victorious, indomitable, immortal. To the people who could not read, the carvings were not stories, they were reality itself. And in this reality, the Battle of Kadesh became eternal, not because of what truly happened on the plains, but because of how it was presented. This silence is more than aesthetic, it is psychological. Stone imposes scale and permanence. A single figure of Ramesses towering above fallen Hittites creates a visceral impression. Even if one knew the facts, the eyes and the mind are overwhelmed. The monuments functioned like a message broadcast across centuries. This is what victory looks like. This is who rules. This is what history remembers. Facts, uncertainty, and doubt are drowned beneath the weight of bronze, limestone, and divine symbolism. The pharaoh's narrative became the only one visible to the common citizen, controlling perception long before mass media existed. The Hittite perspective, preserved in fragile clay tablets far from Egypt, offers a stark contrast. Kadesh was a hard-fought stalemate. The Egyptian army had been caught in a near-catastrophic ambush, and victory was far from certain. Unlike the stone reliefs, these records were practical and factual. Troop movements, chariot counts, logistics. They celebrated strategic defense rather than personal heroism. This contrast highlights the deliberate manipulation in the Egyptian narrative. The event itself was less important than how it was remembered. History, in Egypt, was as much a tool of governance as of education or religion. The implications extend beyond the battlefield. Kadesh demonstrates one of the earliest lessons in statecraft. Controlling memory is as crucial as controlling territory. Ramses II understood that the human mind responds not only to fact, but to certainty, spectacle, and repetition. A heroic story carved into stone is not merely decoration. It is an assertion of power that shapes belief, molds loyalty, and silences doubt. Generations internalized the message of Kadesh without questioning it because it was monumental, undeniable, and reinforced through ritual, art, and religion. The pharaoh did not just fight a war, he fought the perception of that war, and in that battle, he triumphed. This lesson is deeply human and profoundly modern. Today, narratives are controlled not through stone, but through media, algorithms, and curated information. The principle remains identical. Perception can outweigh reality, repetition can outweigh evidence, and authority can outweigh truth. Kadesh offers a chilling reminder that truth requires effort, curiosity, and skepticism. It survives only when someone is willing to look beyond what is presented as absolute. The first great lie carved in stone is not just an ancient phenomenon. It is a warning echoing across millennia. Yet, there is resilience embedded in history itself. While monuments may be permanent, truth has its own stubborn persistence. The Hittite archives endured, waiting centuries to be rediscovered, patiently preserving a reality that had been suppressed. Through archaeology, critical study, and comparison of sources, historians have reconstructed the events behind the Egyptian narrative, revealing the delicate interplay between fact and fiction. Kadesh teaches that history is not a single, immutable story, but a tapestry woven from evidence, interpretation, and sometimes deliberate deception. Finally, Kadesh challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, memory, and belief. It shows that victories are not always what they seem, that monuments do not always tell the truth, and that humanity's understanding of the past is profoundly shaped by those who control its narrative. The pharaoh may have carved his victory into stone, but the full story required centuries, painstaking scholarship, and the courage to question authority. The battlefield may have ended, but the lesson of Kadesh, that reality can be obscured by spectacle and memory manipulated by power, continues to resonate, haunting every attempt to separate fact from myth. In the end, the silence of stone is both magnificent and terrifying. It immortalizes not just events, but ideas, beliefs, and illusions. Kadesh endures because it was never just a battle. It was a demonstration of control, an exhibition of how human perception can be shaped, bent, and ultimately directed by those in power. The Battle of Kadesh was not an isolated anomaly. It was a prototype. What Ramses II achieved on the walls of his temples would be repeated, refined, and perfected by rulers across civilizations and centuries. From Assyrian reliefs showing kings slaughtering enemies without mercy, to Roman triumphal arches celebrating victories that concealed brutal stalemates, the lesson of Kadesh spread silently. Control the narrative, and you control memory itself. Once a version of events becomes dominant, alternative truths fade into obscurity, not because they are false, but because they are unseen. History books, especially in their earliest forms, were rarely neutral records. They were instruments of legitimacy. Victors, or those who survived with enough power, shaped chronicles to justify rule, suppress dissent, and construct identity. The language of conquest, heroism, and divine favor appears again and again, masking political failures and strategic compromises. Kadesh stands at the very beginning of this tradition, marking the moment when warfare ceased to be remembered purely through outcome and began to be remembered through curated storytelling. Over time, these stories hardened into accepted truth. What began as propaganda became tradition, then education, then unquestioned fact. Generations learned history not as investigation, but as inheritance. By the time alternative sources surfaced, foreign records, archaeological evidence, conflicting accounts, the dominant narrative was already entrenched. To challenge it was to challenge authority itself. In this way, lies did not simply persist. They became history. The danger of this transformation lies not only in falsehood, but in comfort. A clean, heroic story is easier to accept than a complex, ambiguous reality. Societies gravitate toward narratives that reinforce pride, identity, and moral clarity. Kadesh offered Egypt all three: a heroic king, a divine victory, and a reaffirmation of cosmic order. The truth, confusion, near defeat, and compromise, was inconvenient. And so, it was erased not by destruction, but by replacement. What makes Kadesh especially significant is not that it was deceptive, but that it was successful. For centuries, no one questioned the Egyptian version. The stone reliefs outlasted witnesses, texts, and even languages. By the time historians could read hieroglyphs again, the lie had already achieved immortality. This success set a precedent. Truth does not need to be eliminated if it can simply be overshadowed. In the modern world, the same mechanism operates with new tools. Monuments have become screens, inscriptions have become headlines, and repetition has become amplification. The platforms have changed, but the psychology remains the same. Authority, scale, and confidence shape belief far more effectively than nuance or evidence. Kadesh reminds us that misinformation does not require malice alone, it requires passive acceptance. Ultimately, Part 7 confronts a troubling realization. History is not a stable record of the past, but a battlefield in its own right. Competing narratives fight for dominance, and those backed by power often prevail. The Battle of Kadesh may have ended in stalemate, but the war over its meaning was decisively won by the pharaoh. And once a lie becomes history, undoing it requires more than evidence. It requires the willingness to question what has always been accepted as true. The Battle of Kadesh did not truly end on the plains beside the Orontes River. When the chariots withdrew and the dust settled, the physical conflict ceased, but another battle began, one far more enduring and far more consequential. This was the battle over meaning, over memory, over who would decide what the future remembered as truth. In this second conflict, weapons were replaced by images, strategy by symbolism, and victory by permanence. Ramesses II may not have conquered Kadesh, but he conquered something far more powerful: the story of Kadesh. What makes this battle timeless is its familiarity. Humans do not remember events as they occur. They remember them as they are told. Repetition shapes belief. Authority shapes acceptance. Scale shapes conviction. The monumental reliefs of Egypt were not passive records. They were active instruments of persuasion. Anyone who stood before them was not invited to analyze or question, but to absorb. The pharaoh understood something profoundly modern. People trust what feels permanent, and they believe what appears uncontested. Stone created the illusion of consensus, and consensus created the illusion of truth. Across centuries, this mechanism repeated itself again and again. Empires rose and fell, yet the technique remained unchanged. Kings commissioned chronicles, conquerors erected monuments, and states curated narratives that favored strength over honesty. Defeats were softened, failures reframed, and compromises erased. Kadesh was not the last time history was rewritten. It was the moment humanity learned that memory could be engineered. From that moment forward, history became as much a product of power as of evidence. What makes Kadesh especially haunting is how long the illusion endured. For more than 3,000 years, the Egyptian version stood largely uncontested, not because it was true, but because it was visible. The Hittite records existed, but they were buried, fragile, and forgotten. This imbalance of visibility is crucial. Truth does not always disappear. It is often simply hidden, waiting for someone to care enough to look. The rediscovery of Hittite archives did not erase the monuments. It challenged them, reminding us that even the most authoritative narratives can be incomplete or deliberately misleading. This realization forces an uncomfortable reflection on the present. Today, we are surrounded by narratives carved not in stone, but in constant streams of information. The tools have changed, but the dynamics have not. Visibility still determines belief. Repetition still shapes memory. Authority still defines what is accepted as fact. Kadish teaches that lies do not need to be sophisticated. They need to be consistent, confident, and unchallenged. And once embedded, they become self-sustaining, defended not by evidence, but by familiarity. Yet the story of Kadesh is not only a warning, it is also a testament to human curiosity and resilience. The truth survived because someone questioned the stone, because someone compared sources, because someone refused to accept monumentality as proof. Archaeology, linguistics, and critical scholarship peeled back layers of narrative until reality emerged, fractured and complex. This process was slow, imperfect, and incomplete, but it proved something essential. History can be corrected, even if it cannot be undone. In the end, Kadesh asks a question that transcends time. Who controls the story, and why do we believe it? The pharaoh's lie endured because it was carved in stone, but its power faded when people learned to question permanence itself. The battle that never ended is not between Egypt and the Hittites, but between narrative and truth, authority and inquiry, comfort and complexity. And as long as stories are told, that battle will continue. The first lie ever carved in stone still stands, weathered, majestic, and silent. It no longer speaks with the authority it once held, but it remains as a reminder, not of Egyptian greatness nor of military triumph, but of a deeper human vulnerability, our willingness to mistake permanence for truth. Kadesh endures not because it was won, but because it teaches us that history is not something we inherit passively. It is something we must question, examine, and constantly defend. And that is why this ancient battle still matters today.